participate. But on TIMS, they participated in one TIMS, and we've had 4 of those as well. Their performance on algebra and geometry, which you might argue are the bedrocks of higher mathematics, was below the international average of 500. So, on a technical sense, the Finns are not doing very well. And this has created all sorts of concerns in Finnish higher education communities because their kids are not being prepared. But what is most interesting for me, and this is the most interesting cultural aspect of all of this, is here. You may know, or you may not know, Finland is 95% Finnish speaking. With a few other exceptions, the remainder are Swedish speaking. It's a relatively small group in the western part of Finland. But what is interesting, and they perform less well on PISA 2009 than the Finnish-speaking Finns. However, the Swedish-speaking Finns go to equally well-funded schools. Those schools are Swedish language schools. They have the same curriculum. There is no apparent distinction to be made between Finnish-speaking Finnish schools and Swedish-speaking Finnish schools, but the Swedish-speaking Finns still do better on PISA than the Swedish-speaking Swedes. Now, overlay, then there's a cultural thing going on here, which must be to do with being Finnish rather than some sort of set of curriculum. What's even more exciting, essentially, is the Swedish-speaking Finns are the economic elite. 25, they represent 5% of the population, but they represent 25% of Finnish board members. If a Finn holds or has shares, a Swedish-speaking Finn has 3 times as many as a Finnish-speaking Finn. So this is an intellectually powerful, an economically powerful group. And in every other culture I know, the economically powerful perform educationally higher than the economically weak. So there's something really interesting and culturally different, I think, about Finland. Well, yes, they work with, I call it implicit tradition, teaching, blah, blah. Yeah. Right, let's move on then. So let's look at this from a historical perspective. What do we know about Finland? Finland for centuries was a Swedish vassal. So there's a strong, in a sense, resistance to Swedish values and norms. For most of the 19th century, Finland was a Russian state, another colonial occupier. And so there's a resistance to Russian influence. The Finns guard their Finnish culture violently. The Finns are a Lutheran community, and for 400 years there was a public reading test to determine whether or not you could take the sacraments. And if you failed this reading test called the kinkerit, you couldn't take the sacraments. Now the fundamental consequence of this within Finnish culture is if you can't take a sacrament, you can't marry. And putting that crudely, you can't read, you don't get laid, seems to me to be quite a powerful incentive to learn to read. So that the Finns have created a culture with a high expectation, not only with respect to learning, but one's personal responsibility for that learning. Such that it is the densest, bearing in mind how sparsely populated this country is, there are more libraries per capita than anywhere else in the world, and the Finns borrow more library books than anywhere else in the world. And so if PISA is an assessment of what they call mathematical literacy, which is about reading a text, interpreting the text, and then doing some fairly basic arithmetic, then it's not surprising that the Finns perform well on those sorts of tests. And it explains why there is essentially no illiterate underclass. So, moving on from Finland, I'm back to Hungary. Sasha mentioned Fazekas, which is one of the leading gymnasiums in Hungary. That's it. And there's an interesting story here too. It is an elite school within the Hungarian culture. You will not meet a Hungarian probably who has not heard of this school. And it has a very, very long, well-established tradition of good mathematics teaching. What's not so well known, which again confounds my Western perspective on this sort of thing, is this is in the heart of the red light district. For those of us who are not familiar with English culture, the red light district is the district where one might, as a man, wander the streets to find a lady of the night. So this is an area riven with prostitutes. In this country, you would never find an elite school in the heart of the red light district. So anyway, this is a very brief introduction to percentages from a teacher in the school. I'll find my cursor. Now that was the introduction to a lesson on percentages. And what I think is interesting is, thus far we've not heard the word. This is a problem posed for homework yesterday. Hungarian kids do their homework. And importantly, the homework... It depends on the school. But importantly, the homework typically is a link between one lesson and the next. It's not an arbitrary collection of activities. It has a structural importance. And what I like about this lesson here is we're leading towards a lesson on percentages, so the homework is a problem on proportionality. And she's going to use a series of proportional reasoning type questions to lead into the convention that is percentages. So, very different, I think, from the finish. So, models of culture, do they help us? Can they help us understand how curricula, how classrooms, how learning is structured? I don't know if I said, does anyone know Hofstede? He did a really interesting study in the late 60s, early 70s, where he surveyed twice all the employees of IBM. So this is like a 40-nation study. Now, because of the time at which it was undertaken, that meant that most countries behind the Iron Curtain weren't involved. So Hungary was not involved in this. Yugoslavia was. So, because by that time Yugoslavia was, I guess, slightly more liberal than some of the other hardline states. But most of those socialist states of the Soviet era were not involved. And he identified 4 what he called dimensions of culture as a consequence of his factor analysis of his data. And he talks about power distance, the extent to which we are prepared to be led, or the extent to which we expect to be able to show initiative. So, this is, if you like, a continuum. Those who are led, those who expect, or those who accept being led, those who expect to show initiative. Power distance. Individualism, a typical construct of the social theorists, or the cultural theorists. Individual cultures essentially versus collective cultures. And those are 2 of his 4. And then he graphs them. And so we have a whole set of his 40 nations identified on there in terms of the individualism versus what he describes as power distance. So here we have the Brits. I'm doing some work with the Swedes at the minute. Got Sweden identified here. But if you look at this bottom left-hand corner, so it's a small power distance. We expect to show initiative. It's high on individualism. And we see here Northern European, Nordic, Anglophone countries. Up here, where we have high power distance and low individualism, or essentially more collectivism, we have many of the sort of South American states, Southeast Asian states, and so on. And those of you who are not any of those can identify where you are there. So, for example, that's where Hofstede places our French colleagues, or our Belgian colleagues, which I think is interesting, because I think if you ask a Belgian, they're either Flemish or Walloon. And I think the Flemish and the Walloons will say they are different culturally. So you've got to look at this with a certain degree of scepticism, perhaps. He also talks about uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which people are made uncomfortable by unstructured situations, or the extent to which they're happy to work with them. My experience of Hungarians is Hungarians don't like unstructured situations. You give them a mathematical problem that is ill-defined, and they reject it. They don't like it. Masculinity is opposed to feminine cultures. The extent to which people are prepared to accept that roles are not gender defined, beyond the biological necessities, obviously, or when cultures where all roles are gender defined. And again, he graphs those. And we can see now quite a distinction between the Brits and the Swedes. The Swedes, as are the other Scandinavian countries, even the Nordic countries, there's Finland, are essentially feminist. Roles are not defined by gender. These are feminine cultures going that way.
Feminine cultures are cultures that don't.
Yes, in his definition, a feminine culture is one that doesn't differentiate. It's his word, his pose. A masculine culture is one where roles are well defined by gender. Now, that's how he portrays different cultural groups. I think they're interesting and they have some potential to explain. He then goes on to try and articulate how these would play out in classrooms. So, we've got uncertainty avoidance, and I've got power distance, weak on the left, strong on the right. How he sees this playing out in classrooms. Now, we haven't got time to read them all, but you can see some of them for yourself. So, in a weak uncertainty avoidance culture, that is a culture like the British, where we are not worried by unstructured situations. Teachers are prepared or allowed to say, I don't know. In a strong uncertainty avoidance culture, teachers would not say, I don't know, because they are expected to have all the answers. And as you read those sorts of statements, you may or may not resonate with what he's trying to say. But I think they do offer some powerful insights into how different cultures construct communities of learners. And so on. I'm going to stop in a few minutes, so I'll skip those. Oh yes. William Cummings, an American, well he's British, he works in America, sociologist of education, has made the conjecture that all the world's curricula are derivatives of 6. And in some sense, for example, we saw yesterday talking about the Brazilian engineers. You could argue that in that particular context, there was a strong French influence. But Cummings basically says most curricula throughout the world are derivatives of those 6, what he calls the Prussian, the French, the UK, United States, Japan, and Russia. Now, if that's true, then of course that has other consequences. My take on the Hungarian context is I can see both German and Russian traditions embedded within modern Hungary. I can see the Germanic tradition because Hungary was once upon a time part of the Austrian Empire. 20th century, for large chunks of the 20th century, there was a Soviet influence on Hungary. And I can see in the way in which Hungarian mathematics plays out in classrooms elements of the Soviet tradition, the collective, the way in which there will be the child coming to the board is intended to represent the collective view.
Well, before we go to it, public school in the United Kingdom mean Eton, or it means...
Yes, exactly that. Sorry, yes, thank you, gentlemen. For those of us who are not British, this is one of the eternal enigmas of educational discourse. In every system bar this one, pretty well, the public school is the state-funded school to which most children go. In this country, the public school is the elite, fee-paying, independent school.
Just try to be
So in this country, the public school is where, for example, most of our Conservative Prime Ministers attended. Eton, Harrow.
The public school, indeed.
The public school. And when they were founded in the 16th century, these were intended to be public schools, schools for the public. But over time, that original conception altered. These have become very elite, very expensive fee-paying schools. So we've got 6 models. Oh yeah, okay, this is... I'll just do this and I'll stop, okay. This is another Hungarian example. I haven't had time to get the translations done for this. But I just think this is gorgeous. See what you think. Okay, they've counted the four numbers, hard on, hot, heat, teas. She's then asking them, how do I get from the first to the second? And the child just said 4. And she went, so she wants them saying, I'm adding on 4. Sorry. She's now got a set of cards. On each card is a letter. And she's now asking them a set of questions, and each time you get a question right, and the question will relate to those numbers already on the board, she'll then indicate the letter for that number. So there's a sort of game going on, but there's still mathematics behind the game. They still have to answer questions relating to those numbers. Now she's got to the point where only 10 hasn't got a letter. Now she turns it back on them. Give me a problem where the answer's 10. So instead of her asking the question and then